Did I say your last name right?
You did.
Okay. She has been amazing. She teaches some of the best classes in the Atlanta area. She's a history buff like I am and loves architecture like I do as well. And she's been kind enough to teach a class for us here in Philadelphia. She runs one of the best inspection companies in the Atlanta market. You guys have expanded to Charleston now, right?
Yeah, we're in South Carolina as well. So those of you who have Southern roots, we're here for you.
Yeah, I just need you guys to come up to Philly also.
I agree.
Anyway, so Mel's going to be teaching a class for us on architecture, and I'm excited because one of the things I love about being a realtor is that it incorporates my art history and my architecture background into my everyday work life. And the more we learn and the more that we can give knowledge to our clients, the better value we provide. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Mel.
All right, and then let me do the screen share piece. I'm going to ask you while I share my screen. I want you all to think about that time. I can't believe it's been 24 years for you, Valerie, but I'll believe you if you insist.
That was 10. What are you talking about?
Of course. I want you to think back about that moment you decided to get your real estate license and how long ago that's been for you. And I want you to try and remember why you got it. Sometimes that sounds a little more facetious than it's intended, but think about what that was. Like somebody said to you, you should get your real estate license, or you thought it to yourself. And what was
what's the word I'm looking for? Gosh, just play along, chime in. I can't think of the right word. This is a class that Mel's going to teach, but I'm sure she wants everyone to join in on.
Yes, I'm happy to have you. I'm happy to have you join in. So
yes, interactive. Thank you, Gavin.
Although I am not as good. If I'm teaching, I am not going to be very interactive with the chat. I'll try, but Valerie, just interrupt me if I should.
Sure. Okay.
So likely you had reasons. When I do this class in person, I hear reasons like I wanted to help people. I wanted to control my own hours, which a little bit of a joke when you get into the reality of real estate. I wanted to make a lot of money. I wanted to control my income. I wanted to own my own business. Those types of answers are what I get. And every time I have at least one person in the class who says, because I love houses. And I think that all of those other things you can do in many other fields. You can control your hours. You can make a lot of money. You can help people. But if there isn't some love of houses, I think you, I don't maybe know why you chose real estate. So I hope that if nothing else, we get back to that little belief and spark more delight for your love of houses in what we talk about today. So I am taking a 3-hour class that realtors in Georgia use for continuing education and narrowing it down to 1 hour. So we're probably not going to get through all of it. I will send Valerie my slides so that you have some of the illustrations that I think might be helpful. And I think it's okay. Whatever we get to is what we were meant to get to. And because I think it's okay as long as you have sparked that renewed love and you look at houses a little bit differently, and maybe you'll go down your own rabbit hole when we're done. So I have a rule for all my classes, and it comes from E.B. White. He wrote Charlotte's Web, and he said, I wake up every morning determined to do 2 things. 1, change the world, and 2, have a hell of a good time. So let's do, that's my intention. I want your world to get better as realtors because you spent this hour with me, and I want us to have some fun, especially since we get to look at fun stuff. The contents have nothing to do with Atlanta housing. I'm sorry. We're going to go through a few shapes and details, just some of the fun ones. Then I'm going to talk to you about architectural categories as defined by Virginia and Lee McAllister. They wrote, let me grab it.
I have my copy here too.
Yeah, everyone will get your a field guide to American houses. This is fascinating. So instead of asking me what style a house is, Go ask Valerie to look it up, because they have in the beginning of the book, you can just look at different features.
I'm gonna go grab mine.
And then it will show you which styles to check. So we'll go through some of the building shapes and details, then they categorize architecture based on what it's inspired by into 5 different categories. And so we'll spend a good amount of our time there, and then we'll get to some specific house styles as well. By the end of the session, I want you to be able to distinguish certain architectural features and call roofs the right thing, and call dormers the right thing, and entablatures the right thing. And then I want you to understand the difference between an architectural period and an architectural style. They are 2 very different things. For instance, Victorian is a period, not a style. There are several styles that came about in that period. Same is true with colonial. And then I want us to understand those 5 main categories and identify several popular styles. We only have an hour. Even if we had 3, I still say nobody's going to get a PhD. I don't have one. I've just done a ton of reading and a ton of looking. And so I'm here to share what I have with you and hope that it sparks some interest where you can go find more that helps you become a realtor, a better realtor. These are the sources, the primary sources that I have used, and so they'll be on those slides if you want further information. One more shout out to Philadelphia. So I'm from the West, actually, and have been in the South for about 20 years, but I love Philly. I love to visit there. My parents went to University of Pennsylvania. My dad rode on the crew team there, and he was super excited the day they beat Harvard, he told me.
I'm sure.
Isn't that funny? When I was a little kid, we went to Philadelphia once, and I remember having my first cheesesteak and thinking, this is why people eat sandwiches. So I know super touristy, but I now, in the normal world, my boys play lacrosse, and so we are in Philadelphia probably like 3 to 5 times a year. So I love looking at all your buildings.
Well, the next time you come up, you'll have to do this in person.
Yes, wouldn't that be fun?
I'd love it.
I would love to meet all of Valerie's friends. So homes are predominantly rectangular, and one of my favorite things to do is to break the rules. So I love to prove, these are the exceptions, I guess, that prove the rule. I think this house has like maybe 8 or 10 sides, which makes me not know what it's called, but we actually inspected this house. Here's another house in the Atlanta area that is round, so it's breaking the rules as well. But think about why homes tend to be square or rectangular. Usually cities were laid out in grids. It makes planning those houses easier. It makes decorating those houses easier. We also inspected this one. It's on the river, and it's an arrow shape. I don't know if you can see my mouse.
Oh yeah, that's cool.
That's the point of the arrow. So you can always find an exception, but predominantly homes are rectangular. When we talk about how many stories a house has, now I don't know about your FMLS or where you share your listings in Philadelphia. I'm talking about architecturally speaking with stories, not if I were trying to sell a house. You can have a story, 1.5 stories, 2 stories, 2.5 stories, and then you can also have split levels, a side split or a back split. And I wonder if you know what the difference is between a half story and a whole story. Anyone want to guess?
Would it be, so I've seen a lot of Craftsman bungalows that have been, that are like 1.5 stories, and it was because they had permanent stairs to the attic.
Yeah, and even if that attic is finished, another popular style for that is Cape Cod. So the difference is whether you have 8-foot ceilings with no slopes on the second level.
Oh, interesting.
If you
Someone thought it was the steps to go up.
No, I mean, obviously you have to have steps to get there. Now, if I were selling this house right here, I would never say it was a half story, because it's obviously likely got living space there, but that's architecturally, whether it's a half or a whole story, is whether those roof lines slope below or above the foot. What do you think has affected our floor plans? I'm going to ask you in the last 100 years, and then I'm going to tell you the 100 years before that. A lot of what affects existing on the planet in some form shelter and dwelling, heat has definitely changed primarily about 200 years ago. We didn't even have, they had open fires until about the 1600s. That's when chimneys were created, and only the very wealthy people had chimneys, which is why you see in some of the revivals that go back to that, like a Tudor revival, that chimney will be in the front of the house, because if you were very wealthy, you put your chimney in the front so everybody knew you had one. So isn't that fascinating? So we didn't even have, we had fireplaces, and a lot of the times they just had one chimney in the center going up, and so your rooms had to be shaped around where you could heat. Cast iron stoves that vented to the exterior came about, and then it wasn't until 1880, which again, in the course of humans living in dwellings is like yesterday, that we got coal furnaces that burned coal. This furnace here is from the 1920s, so it's 100 years old, and it looks like way older than that. So if I asked you that question today, you probably wouldn't say heat. Between 1920 and 2020, that's changed our floor plans. What might you say? I'm going to give you the answer. In the interest of time, what I would say, a lot of times people say open floor plans, and they talk about entertaining, but I don't think we do any more entertaining than we've ever done before. And our entertaining has definitely changed, because if you were wealthy enough to have help, you didn't entertain next to your help, and now more people don't have that kind of help. So open floor plans definitely have changed, but yeah. I see trend going also back to people wanting more closed rooms. So I don't know if that's a trend, but I would argue that garages and allocating square footage to our cars is probably the biggest change in floor plans in the last 100 years. So if you think about something that's been built within the last 100 years, it likely had some form of car storage as well. And none of the styles we're going to talk about today, those architects, they didn't even have cars. So they didn't even think about how you would store your car. Let's go into some of the shapes. The most common thing that, that you will find shapes on relates to the roof. So you can have flat roofs. We see those a lot in mid-century modern architecture, and also in what you all call row houses. We call them townhomes. And oftentimes you'll have this little ledge. Anytime you see a ledge on a house, it's called a parapet wall. So they often separate those row houses, or they separate the roof from the rest of the exterior. So this is an example of a parapet wall. And this is my only inspector note, is that flat roofs tend to leak. And I will give you a little hint of what your consumer might be like by telling you about what I was like when I was my very first time consumer. I bought a house that was a Craftsman home, and it was 100 years old, which in Atlanta is super old. And the inspector told us that there was a lot of water in the basement, but it was an exterior entrance to the basement. And I literally said to him, well, that's okay, because we're not going to use it. And, I had no idea what water could do to a house. And this just, so when I saw this first slide, when I first joined Home Pro about 7 years ago, I saw this slide as my boss was teaching a class. This just shows you the damage water can do to a house. So that's why we care so much about water, is because it does a lot of damage. 1 inch of water in a 20-foot by 20-foot square foot area. So like think of about a great room. That 1 inch of water weighs 1 ton.
Holy cow.
Think about how many pounds a ton is. It's 2,000 pounds. So that's doing a lot of damage to a roof. And so those roof joists start to sag, and then the water has no choice but to pond. And so it's a problem that continues to create itself. Good inspectors will tell you that you can always install. There's always a fix, right? You can install any drain, but that's why flat roofs tend to cause problems. In sloped roofs, these are the different shapes. So I'm going to show you the illustrations, and then we'll talk about them in real life. So the most simple sloped roof is a shed roof. You see those a lot on porches that have been added on, and that's just where there's one side sloping. It's called a shed roof. Often you'll see those show up on inspections if they don't use the right roof covering. If they're trying to match the other roof above and it doesn't have enough slope, it becomes a problem. Gabled roofs. So these are the roofs that you used to draw when you were in kindergarten, the triangle. Anytime you see a triangle in a house, it's called a gable, almost always. And it doesn't matter if that gable is in the front of the home or the side, it's still a gabled roof. And it can also be symmetric or asymmetric. The reverse of a gable is called a butterfly, which I think are super adorable, and they're super rare because they're not naturally shedding and they cause problems too. Hip roofs are really common in Georgia and common in the federal style as well. And this is where you have the ridge board going down the center and the hip rafters that come off the sides. So I see a lot of people would look at this roof and call it a tiled roof. And that's not right, because while it is covered in tile or slate, it is still called a hip roof. So you call a roof by the shape of a roof, and then the covering of the roof is obviously what it's covered in. This is a gambrel roof. It's what we associate with Dutch colonial styles. And then this is the Mansard roof. It comes to us from France, and I'm sure I'm going to botch his name, but this is a picture of the architect who created the Mansard roof in the 1620s. At the time in France, there was property was taxed only under the roof line. So if you had this style of a roof instead of a gable, think about how much more living space you got on that second floor. This is where French doors come from, because people started putting more and more ventilation on those second floors, and that's the Mansard roof. So there's an example of one. Another.
And they used that to get away from additional taxation, because a lot of the attic spaces in France, like when you go through Paris and you see that roof line, there's living space up there.
Yeah, it's like actually your second story. It's sort of, I think in the United States there were areas where if your room didn't have a closet, it was taxed differently. So that's why closets came about later. So taxation definitely does influence architecture. That's why I ask that question more often. The little curves off of a gabled roof are called bel castives, and they're not great in cold climates. We see them in the South quite a bit. Some people call them eyelashes, and this is has a lot of French influence, so the French influence is there as well. And then I've noticed in the selection of houses that Valerie sent me that you all have a lot of widow's walks because you're a port city. And so a lot of people know where a widow's walk came from, that people would go, you know, before you had Find My iPhone or Find My iPhone, where you could see where someone was. If you didn't know, if your husband was whaling or something like that, you didn't know when they were coming back, you could go up and look. The other version for a widow's walk that people are less familiar with is if you actually became a widow, you were housebound by tradition for a period of time. And so this is somewhere where you could go get some fresh air. And that's another reason.
Like sheltered in place.
Oh. Yes, I wish I had a widow's walk.
Same.
Cupolas come from Italy. So think about being able, and they were actually big whole rooms when they were originally designed. Sometimes they're just used for architectural effect now. But think about being able to look over the Tuscan countryside. That's where the idea of a cupola comes from. Oops, I already did widow's walk. And then we have my favorite architectural feature, which is a turret or a tower. So this is a structure. Whether it comes from the roof line or goes all the way down to the foundation determines its name. So a turret comes from the roof line or doesn't go all the way down to the foundation, and a tower goes all the way down. I think of it like Rapunzel. She had to let her hair all the way down from the tower to be saved. So a tower goes all the way down to the ground. So this one is a turret, and this one is a tower. Those are really popular on.
I know that house.
Oh, you do? Those are really popular on Queen Anne style homes. And then the difference between a dormer and a window is whether that dormer comes from dormir, I think I'm saying that right, which is another French word. So it's almost like its own little room with a window and a roof. So they can add they can add functionality by increasing the space. So a lot of times when people pop the second story off, they'll add a dormer. They add light, they add ventilation for homes that don't have air conditioning and need that. And they're called by whatever their roof shape is, unless they're an inset shape. So we will, the only exception to that is an inset dormer. And I'll show you some examples. They're easier to see in real life. Most people do not love this one, the eyebrow in the illustration. It looks a little weird. And then they either love or hate them in real life. So can you see these dormers? I'm gonna have you guess. Those two are the same. Those are arched. And then this one is a triangle. So what does that make it?
A gable.
Oh, there's a couple of gables. What about that one? Just one slope on the roof. Do you remember? It's a shed. The simplest slope roof line is the same as a dormer. This one is a flat roof, and we can tell because we can't see the slope on it from the ground. And so it is obviously called a flat dormer. And this gives you an example of the difference between dormers and windows. So this is a bay window. It has its own roof, but it doesn't come from the roof line. These roof line, they're a little harder to see. Those are hipped roof dormers.
Interesting.
This one is the arched. And then when that arch just barely peeks down, it's called segmental. I think this one is adorable. And then this, sometimes in real life, this class is a lot of fun because I have some ugly versions of that I pull, or things, I guess I shouldn't call them ugly. They're all neutral. It's what you think about it, things I might not necessarily love. And a lot of times when I say, what style is this? People will say tear down. So this is an inset dormer. And I wanted to show you a cute one too. So look how cute. In fact, they make little pop-up balconies where you can get a railing on them as well. So I believe any architectural style can be. And then this is our eyebrow dormer. So see how much cuter it is in real. The cornice is the entablature. And you all, especially if you have so many federal buildings, that you have lots of bold entablatures based on the time period that they were built in. The entablature is this whole area between the roof, the wall, and just the top piece is called the cornice. The middle piece is called the frieze, and the bottom is called the architrave. So that's smarter. Those can be decorated with dentils. You remember from 4th grade, like it looks like teeth, or brackets. There's an example of the brackets and the dentils. And then siding, which is common in Tudor Revival, but it's also common in stick-built homes, which is stick-style homes, not stick-built homes, is called half timbering, and I think it has a fun history. So it doesn't have to be in those styles, but sometimes you'll see it in them. They're popular in them. It actually goes back to where a home's structure was on the outside as well as the inside, and they would cut the log in half for economical reasons. And so this that's why it's called half timbering. So you would see the opposite half on the outside that would on the inside. Now, homes built in the United States did not have that. We're talking about homes like this. This is in England. It was built in 1500. And it looks like it needs an inspector, but also that's standing for 500 years. It's probably going to be fine. I think window glazing is really fun, and I bet you guys have a lot of what we commonly call wavy glass. And it got me thinking about when our windows stops becoming wavy. And I actually found out glass is something that goes all the way back to the Roman era. And so we've known how to blow as humans. We've known how to blow glass for a long period of time, but it was lost during the Dark Ages. And so I hear a lot about like or I've read a lot in the course of my life about something lost in the Dark Ages, and I didn't ever really know what that meant. So I asked his sister, who's a history teacher, and she was saying it's because all the people who knew how to do it either died of illness or were killed in a war. Wow. And so we lost as humans the ability to blow glass. So it existed before these medieval castles that had the very narrow windows, and we didn't get it back until the 14th century. I think it's fascinating. When it came back, it was called crown glass. It was blown in circles, and a little bit like the bottom of a Coke bottle. And they kept creating better and better technology to the point where you could get sheets of it, but it was really expensive, which puts into perspective Versailles. So those of you who have been to Versailles, that Hall of Mirrors was in 1680. So not that long after we relearned how to blow glass. And it just puts how impressive that wall is, the one side mirrors and the other side, all those glass doors, into perspective. The Hall of Mirrors was also, I learned, chamber pot area for women. So isn't that funny that we're off? We think it's such a cool thing now. Glass became more predominant after this is a building that was called the Crystal Palace, and it was built for a World's Fair, which was called the Great Exhibition in London in 1851. And that building is talked about as the things they showed in the building. And that's because of all the glass, because at the time, glass was taxed about 50% in England. And so people just had little tiny, a Georgian style versus a federal style. Those styles are very related. The federal styles and the later styles tend to have bigger panes of glass. So you'll see 6 over 6 instead of 12 over 12. And part of that came because of the Great Exhibition. People saw this glass. That's one of the reasons that that glass came down in price in terms of taxation. It became much more accessible for people. That glass blowing technique that created the wavy glass changed right around the turn of the century. So that's when you typically see a change. And I always like to wonder, you know, when we get new technology now, like we have a lot of love for what we call modern homes, contemporary homes right now, and they're super cool. And it's kind of like all out with the old. And I wonder if that was true with glass. I don't know where I would even find that information out. But you know, if you were a realtor showing a house in all the way to glass now. All right, speaking of glass, the parts of a window, which are also really important. So the glass is the pane. The thing that holds the pane is called a sash. That pane sits on a sill. And then what breaks up a sash, it does not have to physically break up the panes. It just has to visually break up the panes of glass. Those are still muntins. And then if you're breaking up a window, that breakup called a mullion.
I find that more people confuse the muntins and call them mullions.
And there is a window company that does it as well. So that's probably where that comes from, partly. But yeah, that is one thing people also confuse. When we have more time, I spend more time on this slide, but you can find all the parts in it. But you can have lead be your muntin as well. So it doesn't have to be wood. It can be anything. There are lots of different window shapes. The Gothic goes back to Gothic cathedrals and the idea that you were pointing up to God with your point. And then let's talk a little bit about the Palladian window, because it does come from 1980 and the McMansion building era. It comes from Andrea Palladio from Italy, and look how extensive. This Palladian window has full columns in it. It was 3 different parts, and you know, and you had a whole entablature above it. And so when you look at it like that, you're like, oh, I get why we thought that was a gorgeous style. Other windows, bay windows, Oriole windows, and bow windows. And the difference between bay and bow is the shape. So I'll show you. And the shape is rounded for bow. And the difference between a bay window and an Oriole window is whether it goes all the way to the ground. So this one is bay window. And this one is an Oriole window. These were really popular, like in the 50s ranches, like as a kitchen window, and people would put their little plants. The door lights are called, the sides are called obviously side lights. One fun fact is a pilaster is half of a column, it's attached. And so the difference between a column and a pilaster is whether it's attached to the building or not whether it supports weight. The only time we care about whether a column supports weight is in inspection and structure. But it doesn't have to be structurally doing anything to be called a column. It's whether it's attached or not. And then the light above the door can be called a fan light or a transom light. And I loved, this is a fan light. But I loved one of the listings you sent me, Valerie, that had these fun transoms.
Mm-hmm.
Are those gorgeous?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a saying that used to be popular called over the transom. I heard it over the transom. And it's because those transom lights in very old homes used to be part of the ventilation. And so they would open and close. And so if you wanted to send somebody something anonymously, you didn't have the benefit of something out and throw it over the transom.
That's
to
so
like
cool.
an editor of a newspaper, or if you wanted to know who's doing what with who in the neighborhood, you could get anonymous information that way. Columns, like I said, can be freestanding, and they don't have to support these. Just go back to your 4th grade. The main way that a column defines an architectural style is not whether its capital is a Corinthian or an Ionic, Tuscan or Doric. It's how large the column is compared to the structure. So when we get to the two different families of classical, those that have column as opposed to being more scaled elegantly, that's really what determines. It's not whether it's a Corinthian or an Ionic. Speaking of which, let's get into these architectural categories. So it's really important to know that American architecture comes from, a lot of it comes from other places, but that when it came to the United States, it's reflective of the places that it comes from. So that's why you have Dutch and French and German colonial and Spanish colonial type homes. But also the people who came here may not have had the same resources that they had in Europe. And depending on whether they lived close to a port and how many resources they had also ends up influencing their style. And so I love this quote that says that architecture is an art tied to practical purposes. So it is an art form, which is why it varies so much. And it's not like a tree where you can call it based on how many leaves it has and when it flowers, you can exactly categorize it into science, but that it has very severe practical limits. So think about a painting and what goes into a painting. You got like paint, the painter's talent, canvas, some time. And then think about what a painting has to do to serve its purpose. It just has to be visible somewhere, right? And then it serves its purpose. But think about a house and what goes into a house. You still have the artist's time in terms of an architect or a designer, the work people that are crafting that house. And then you've got the stuff for the structure, the stuff for the siding, the stuff for the windows. There's a lot more resources that go into a house. And then think about what a house has to do to serve its purpose. It has to do more than just be pretty and get looked at. And so in fact, I have a job because a house has to do something to function as intended. There's a whole industry built around whether houses function as they're intended or not. And so if we think about it as an art form, but we also remember that it has another purpose, it's helpful. And it will always reflect, well, it's often reflects as a civilization where that civilization comes from. And so that's really fun to think about in terms of American architecture, where our immigrant influence was, what the difference is between weather and economics. And then most European cities were built along ports. And the cities are older than the United States cities. And a lot of United States cities were the original ones were built on ports. And then as we started expanding west, you had rail, and how close you were to that determined what type of access you had to resources, and whether you were building a log cabin or whether you were building a styled house. This is fascinating as well, and you can take this for whatever it's worth and make it mean want. The openness of our floor plans seem to grow in direct proportion to our confidence as a nation. So that's interesting. So a folk house versus, and it's not really a style. And so our very, very old homes that we have in the United States tend to be fashion homes. They tend to be styles. And, but some of those in between were folk. And folk homes meant that they weren't patterned after any particular style, according to Virginia McAllister, that they were just built as a place to live. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just doesn't belong in an architectural style. And so sometimes, and some of those may end up having styles later, like we have in Atlanta one I like to call Postwar Traditional, when all the soldiers came home with GI Bills and we needed housing to be built quickly. And they look like what we kind of call cottages, but they're not quite cottages. The other thing is, if any of you sew, you'll know that you can really change up a pattern. And a lot of our homes were built, the architectural styles were defined by pattern books. And so if you want to change something up, it changes the style a little bit, but where it goes back to. And so that's why another reason where architecture is much more an art than a science. So I like to go back to, my mom used to make us dresses for holidays. And she took me, I was a teenager once, she took me to the store to pick out a pattern for my Easter dress. And I loved none of them because I wanted to go to the mall to get my Easter dress. And so she said, why don't you like any of them? And I said, I want no sleeves. That one has sleeves. And she's like, oh, we can cut the sleeves. We don't have to have sleeves. And I was like, I want it shorter. And she's like, we can make it shorter. So the same is true with taking a pattern of architecture and then you can make changes to it. And that ends up shaping and forming trends that make it really difficult sometimes to tell what style a house is. Generally, styles were separated by locale until about 1840. And fancy that, that's when the train became really popular in the United States. And so that's when we started having more access to more styles. Also around that time period is when A.J. Downing was writing some books. And he was like, you don't have to choose between Italianate or Gothic. You can have all the styles and you can alter your style of home. And so our styles got much looser then. If you love aesthetics, you'll love this quote, because he says, in perfect architecture, no principle of utility will be sacrificed to beauty, only elevated and ennobled by it. So I am an aesthetically driven person. I love aesthetics. And so I love this idea that aesthetics and utility are not in competition with each other, that they build and elevate each other. And he believed that people were educated in their homes, and so that you become better when your aesthetics have improved, and so that you become even a more moral person. So you can take that for what it's worth. Essentially, there are 5 categories of architecture according to the McAllisters, and they come on the scene at different times. The ancient classical comes on the scene after the Renaissance classical, but they're both, if you think about classical, they both go back to anything that we call classical in our culture goes back to ancient Greece and Rome. And so in live class, I'll just ask you, Valerie, since you're participating, have you been to Greece or Rome or both?
I have not been to Greece, I've been to Rome.
Okay, so you've been to Rome. I usually have about a third of the class when I ask has been to Rome, about a 10th has been to Greece, and very rarely have people been to both. So now let's go back 200 years when our country, or 150 years when our country is being built, and think about how many people had been to Greece and Rome to study the architecture. It really took architects to go study it and bring it back in pattern books. And these are where they were inspired if it's a classical style. Medieval style also goes in the Wayback Machine, but it goes back to being inspired by cathedrals. So let's go through some examples as we talk about them. This is Renaissance. This is Rome. So we're looking at the domes, the Roman arch that you can see here, definitely shaped architecture. And then you have Greece, like the Greek temples. Look at those columns and these entablatures. And so the architecture that's shaped by that is called classical. Some is Renaissance, which means a rebirth of that classic. And depending on which country was adopting it is where they put their focal point. British styles tended to focalize on the doors. So you can kind of see that Greek temple in the doorway frame of that house. And look at this one, like with the Ionic columns. If it was Italian, it tended to focus on arches, bringing that Italian arch to the home. And if it was French, it tended to focus on the roof lines. So these are some examples of Renaissance classical. We'll get into the specific examples, but that's the family. So there's several styles in Renaissance classical. Ancient classical is less, it's still inspired by those classic buildings, but instead of wanting to scale it and have it be more elegant and scaled, it's like, I want the Greek temple as my house. That's the Greek Revival style. I want a domed room on my house. And so it's recreating versus being inspired by them. And a lot of our federal buildings were built during this time period. And so that's why you'll see so much, you'll see really bold entablatures. You'll see a lot of symmetry. I mean, this is where you get cherubs and things like that, going back to that classic architecture. There are three different styles within the ancient classical. There's an early classic revival, a Greek, and a neoclassical. And we probably won't have time to talk about all of them, but what's fascinating, the early classic revival is based on Rome, and the Greek revival is based on Greece. And part of that had to do with politics, whether you politically, whether our country was in a time of we're a republic, that was very Roman. And then when the Greek revival came on the scene, it was because we had found some archaeological discoveries that proved Greece was the mother or father of democracy. And so it was actually a political statement to have a Greek revival style home, showing that you're a fan of democracy. And then you have the neoclassical, which is using both. So see how different these columns are than the ones I showed you before? They're still inspired by the same thing. It's like they're cousins of the same family, but it's taking it to a different level. Medieval is inspired by the Middle Ages, the 6th to 15th centuries, where we had castles and churches, so still European, and a lot of those buildings were pre-chimney. The roof tends to be really dominant. So instead of more flat roofs, you have really steep roofs that my inspectors would never climb. This is where you get towers and you get roof details and lots of chimney action happening, where the chimney becomes a focal point of the house. Look at that chimney, isn't that gorgeous?
Beautiful.
These are some of the homes that are medieval style, a lot of the revivals. And then we have modern, and modern is actually two different styles of modern. So modern means that it's not inspired by any of those other things. That's what it means. So modern comes on the scene about 1900, which we now don't think of as very modern. And if you ask me about a craftsman home, I would call it old rather than modern. But you had the arts and crafts movement, and then you had the machine age movement, and they both get put together in the modern style. So the arts and crafts movement was like, we don't need decoration and design. We want to move the traces of the historic origins of the homes. And this is where like there's like kind of a structural integrity to the house. You get a lot more fortitude, like masonry columns that are really holding up the house. So this is where the prairie style comes from Frank Lloyd Wright, is part of the modern movement. And the Craftsman Style. See the beams? Those are representative of, now Craftsman Styles, and they're not actually the structure coming out of the house, but it's representative of a time when the structure would have come out of the house. The machine age, again, is not inspired by old Europe, which means it's modern, and it's what we think of as modern. It's mostly post-World War I, and it is that we wanted machines for living. So anything that is non-functional is gone. There's a standardization of parts. And the difference here is it looks very institutional. So there's not very much decor going on there. And our aesthetic is really liking it right now. But a lot of times people would look at this style of a house and call this modern. And it's exactly the opposite. This is a postmodern house because look at all of the decorative elements. So because they're in like very square shapes and they look a lot like these like institutional stuff, but it's too decorative to be modern, and so it's postmodern. And then you have Spanish and colonial styles. The mission parapet is the main focal point here. And these are really common in the West. We don't have many in Atlanta. I bet you don't have many in Philadelphia. All right, so let's get into some periods. And y'all are so lucky because you have houses built in the 1600s, which is just like, makes me salivate. So this is a colonial period. And what we call colonial styles come from this period, but actually the Colonial Revival movement isn't part of the colonial period. And so it's the only version where colonial is part of the style. So Jamestown was founded in about 1607. I looked up, I think the very first brick maker in Philadelphia was the late 1600s, like 1690. And so as people were coming to what becomes the United States, a lot of them came from England. In Philadelphia, a lot of them came from Germany. And so that's where a lot of your old architecture comes from, but it wasn't really styled. The very first styles we start seeing, the sources I use, Cape Cod and Salt Box as styles. And it's unlikely, you think about life before 1800, it's unlikely that the architecture and style were in the vocabularies of early settlers. So there are a lot of homes that were just folk homes that did survive because they were built very sturdily. And we started recognizing that they were old, like the Puritans. And it's a transition from really steep thatched roofs. So the roofs in London were really steep so that you got rid of the weather elements. And but the ceilings typically were low because of heat reasons. And so these Cape Cods tended to be 1.5 stories high, and a central front door and a central chimney. And the original Cape Cods had no dormers in them. So that's something that came later. They usually were about 1.5 rooms deep. Now, a half a room deep would be something, now we would look at like a galley kitchen or a keeping room, half room deep. So here's an example. And later Cape Cods, the chimneys often moved to the side, but this was back when we had mass chimneys. So you just had one chimney, but several fireplaces that all exited the house at the same place. The term Cape Cod was actually coined by the Yale president when he was writing about his travels in 1800. So it's not really driven by an architect, but people still consider it architectural style. This one, some people don't love, but it's technically a Cape Cod. You can do a lot of different things with the dormers and it gives it a different looks. The Salt Box is really similar to a Cape Cod, and it was popular again in colonial time period, but you had 2 stories on one side, and you had a lot of people living in houses all together, and so adding on to the backs of the homes tended to be popular. So you had that central chimney again because the heating wasn't sophisticated enough to have our chimneys opposite ends. Typically they had unpainted clapboard. In Atlanta there was a house called White Hall because people say it was either it was painted or the wood was bleached because it was typical to not be painted. And the term salt box comes from a couple of things. One is the box people used to keep the salt in was shaped like this, so that's the salt box. And the other is that when you started adding kitchens onto homes, so we used to have detached kitchens, like you have detached garages now, and when they started adding kitchens onto homes, the salt is what we used in our kitchens to preserve, and so the kitchen would be on the back if they added it on. Queen Anne also taxed homes that were over 1 story only. So the whole house would be excluded if you added that 1 story piece in the back. And so that's why you have 2 stories on one side, and then look how many times they added on to that house. Isn't that cute? Here's one where it goes side to side. This is not old, but it's the same idea. And then this is one in Atlanta we would call a tear down that I pulled. So it doesn't matter if the 2 stories is on the back or the front. It's still technically a salt box. All right, Georgian. You all, I'm sure, have a lot of Georgian homes. It is the, in that colonial period, it's the main architecturally driven styled home. And a lot of times we call these 5-4 and a door. It didn't have to have 5 windows, but they did have to be symmetrical. They often had, it often has a very shallow, not steep roof, not, oh, that's shallow, a very low pitch roof line. And they tended to have gable roof lines. It belongs in the, it belongs in that Renaissance classical, because we're rebirthing those old classic buildings onto our houses. And so that's why it's Renaissance, even though it's, even though it comes on the scene before ancient classical. And we're using things like the Pantheon as our front door. So that's where you'll find that old Roman or Greek architecture is showing up on the front door. Again, glass prices were really highly taxed in the panes. We didn't have the technology to create really great panes. And so you had 12/12 or 9/9. Some people like to call what we call Federal, I think you call Federal, an Adam style. They lump it in with Georgian and call it late Georgian because they're in the same family. They're in that same group, and I'll show you on the circle slide in just a second. So you can see where that style comes from.
Beautiful.
So it is in the Renaissance classical, as is the Federal style, but the Federal and Adam style comes in a different time period. Here's another example. So you can see the difference between this and just a folk house is this doorway. We've incorporated those bold entablatures from the classics. Here's another example. The early Republic is a time period from early to mid 1800s, and it's driven a lot by our Declaration of Independence and creating a federal government. And the Federalist Party was a prominent party. So that's why the architecture, the Adam style architecture is often called federal. But that architecture comes from the Adam brothers, who were actually Scottish. And at the time, Britain had a really booming population, and they had the Industrial Revolution was happening there. And they were modernizing their houses. They were making them more brick and fireproofing them. And so these Adam brothers traveled to the Mediterranean and other places to study architecture and brought it back. And this coming back from England is what we get in the United States. And so this is in England. You can see the dome that comes from Rome and these big columns. And then when we incorporate it into our houses, it shows up in like the front doors and these dormer windows. Essentially, we started adding wings onto our traditional Georgian styles and adding the Roman arch. That's the difference between Georgian and Federal and Adam. So you start having Palladian windows, because remember those brothers went to the Mediterranean to study. We have rounded windows in our dormers, and the homes become more stately, is what I call them, with more wings. So this is again a Renaissance classical, because we're not trying to recreate that whole building. We're just trying to incorporate it into our house. This is one, I pulled this because it has this side feature. Does anyone know what that's called? It's called coining with the Q. Q-U-O-I-N, coining. It comes from the French word coin, which means corner. And it's not structurally important, but it has that air about it. But this is a Federal style.
So pretty.
This is a Federal style in Atlanta. This just shows you how you can change different styles. This was built as a Federal style, and then they added this porch to become more Greek Revival. And so it shows you that we are constantly changing our styles. Here's the one I pulled from you, a row house that has that Federal styling. So you can see the Roman arch here. the Roman arches and the dormers. And then as we moved into a period between the Revolution and 1820 where there was also some neoclassicism that came on the scene. Thomas Jefferson started designing based on Rome. He really wanted to incorporate Rome. And this is where an ancient classical style comes on the scene. And the biggest difference, you can see how it would look like a Georgian house. We're trying to recreate, see that, the Pantheon? That's like our front porch. So it's an ancient classical style home. So here's some examples. It kind of looks like South Fork from Dallas. And we have some really beautiful examples, I think. So the main feature is those columns are really prominent. And even though those columns are only one story, you can see the different placement. They're not pilasters against the porch. They're big and bold, and that makes it the ancient classical style as opposed to Renaissance classical. I just got some more examples. To contrast that, the Greek Revival comes about a little bit later, and that it comes about because of that archaeological discovery that I told you about, and also Greece was fighting for their independence, and so people wanted to move away from anything that was British, and this is the style that inspired the house that you all drew in kindergarten, where you drew a box and a triangle on top. That comes from Greek Revival style. So that folk style house that a lot of us see comes from the Greek Revival and is inspired by that. This is what a true Greek Revival looked like, and you can see it looks just like that Greek temple as your house. They put the chimneys as far back as they could. It came on the scene later, so we had multiple chimneys now, and our glass prices were cheaper. So we have bigger panes of glass, 6/6. A lot of people, these were popular in the South a lot, and so a lot of people call them antebellum because of the time period that they were built, but that's a period and not an architectural style. So those are some examples of Greek Revival. I am just going to go, I'm going to skip ahead to the style that ended up really inspiring row on the call. I will stay for a few more minutes and talk about Italian styling because it very much influenced the row house movement in the United States. In Europe, it very much influenced homes, but in the United States, it influenced row style homes. It comes from the same family, that Renaissance classical. We want to bring a stately version of the old Roman and Greek homes, or Greek buildings into our homes. And its main feature is the Roman arches. Where's my mouse? As you can see here, it really blows up those brackets, but the squareness of those towers is also really influential. So this is it in a whole home. The cupola, again, it comes from Italy, so that cupola is prominent and the Roman arch is prominent. And one of the great about it, and one of the reasons it was so popular in the United States, is you could really scale it more or less elegant, and so it's scaled to different economies, and that's another reason that it inspired modern later row houses. So do you see how the squareness of these row houses looks like this square tower? That's where it comes from. It's an Italian style. And I'll finally end with my biggest pet peeve is when people call everything that's built during the Victorian era Victorian. And there are several different styles. So most of what you're calling Victorian is a Queen Anne. There was again, this Crystal Palace. People were mad. People loved the glass. And also they were like, we don't want our houses to look like this in 1850. They were like, it's way too machines. We don't want to live in machines. And the arts and crafts movement came out of that, and a lot of the Victorian period homes came out of that. And they started, you started having better access to saws, and so you could make the scroll work in your homes, and you can make your homes much more ornate. And so Queen Anne is the most popular. When you see a home you want to call Victorian, it's probably Queen Anne. And so they have the turrets and the towers and Palladian windows. And look at all the scroll work on the porches, cresting. I kind of think that Queen Anne is a little bit like when my 8-year-old gets me dressed. My inner 8-year-old gets me dressed, and I should probably take off 2 things. I'm like a little overdone. People really either love them or hate them. They go in the medieval category. It's patterned after castles and churches. There's just some examples of them. I lied, I want to get to one more. And these are folk Victorian. So this is where we just put some of that scroll work on what was inspired by a Greek revival house, our square with a triangle on top. In the eclectic period, the Colonial Revival comes on the scene, and Philly is to thank for that. Because of the centennial in 1876, people started paying more attention to our colonial style homes and reviving them. And so they're very loosely and not usually rightly based on the old Georgian and Adam style, but they still fit in the same family. They're still these Renaissance classical styles. Because again, it's where you're inspired by, not the time period that you're built by. And so these are some examples of Colonial Revival. We lose the symmetry. The symmetry was the biggest rule in their original builds, and you don't have to have it in a revival. So you can kind of tell based on what time period it was built in, whether it was a revival or not, or an original. This one is patterned very closely after that federal style.
And that's got a widow's walk as well.
I know it does, doesn't it? It's kind of fun.
Yeah. If I recall from the Bright Star, it was built, I think in 02. It was like either 02 or 10 in that style.
Cool. Yeah, I think it's really fun. And this one is another one that is hard to, so if you look at the McAllister's book, the period of Colonial Revival went from about 1876 to like 1950. So it's almost its own, there were different versions of it. And these types of style homes are one of the versions of it as well. And so when you see a house like this, it's often a Colonial Revival as well. And that one. All right, I am gonna let you all go. I have fun talking about houses. Valerie, I will send you the slides and you are welcome.
Perfect.
To share
Does
them.
anyone have any questions, any quick last minute questions? Feel free to unmute yourself and ask or put it in the chat. Lots of comments, Mel. Everyone was really enjoying the session.
Good, wow.
Yeah.
Good to see you, Valerie.
Likewise.
I can't wait till you can get on a plane and come back to Atlanta or me to Philly.
I know. This was awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
The next time you are in Philly, you're doing this in person though.
I love it. I love it. All right, y'all take care.
Appreciate you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Lots